This is the first video of Chapter 1, Intro to Sociology, based on the Sociology Second edition of Open Staxx textbook. So over the next few videos, we'll be going over what is sociology, the history of sociology, theory of sociology, and why should you study sociology. So first, let's look at what is sociology. And we can best answer this question of what is sociology by really looking at groups of people. So we're looking at groups of people and studying their interactions. And what does that mean? Well, if we're studying interactions of groups, the social interactions, we can study groups of family members. We can study a family. We can study a sports team. We can study the actions of the fans in a sports team. We can study schools, education, aspects of schools. We can study groups of people who are in a religious organization. So basically, what we are doing as sociologists is we are studying groups. And groups come in various sizes. So you might have a large group, you might have a small group, and that is part of studying not just the groups, the individual groups, but also their group interactions. And we also study society and culture. So what is a society? Well, a society is a group of people who live in a defined geographic area and who will interact with one another, and also who share a common culture. And so this is how we define a society. So your society might be located within a region or a city or a county or a village. And it is just simply living within a specific defined geographic area. But then you also have to interact with people who are in this geographically defined area. And then you also have to share a common culture. And what is a common culture? Well, one of the things about culture is that these are the group's shared practices, their values, and their beliefs. Now, sociologists also study how society affects people and how people affect society. Now, what does that mean? Well, again, what are we doing? We are looking at how our society affects each person within it. So this is at the macro level. And then how do people affect society? So a lot of times we can look at this from a standpoint of making sure that what we are looking at is relevant to today. So currently, we are involved in the midst of a pandemic. So as sociologists, we are studying how the society or our handling of the pandemic affects people, but we are also studying how people are affecting the society. So it's this interaction between people and society that continuously shifts back and forth and influencing each other that sociologists are interested in. Now let's talk about levels of society. So how do we as sociologists study society at different levels? Well, we have this macro level analysis, and what we do at the macro level is that we study trends between large groups and society. So we might study this from like a nation perspective. So how are we interacting as a large group with as the United States? How are we interacting with Europe? Let's look also at our legal system. And this is trends between the large group. The legal system would be the large group in the society. And then also the other aspect of this is what about economics? When we have a bear or a bull market, how does this affect us at a societal level? So that would come under one of the basic social institutions of commerce and government. Now, when we look at micro level analysis, which is small groups and our individual interactions, so this is small, we look at families, and within families, we would look at relationships. So we would look at how all of these different groups might interact. So how would you dictate the rules of conversation between macro and micro level? Well, at a macro level, we might have this idea of being very professional and how we're approaching people. But then at a micro level analysis of communication, what we might look at is how small groups interact. So within families, how do you interact from a conversational perspective? Or even if you are friends, how do friends interact with the other friends? So these different conversation or different levels of study are really important as sociologists study society. Now we also have culture, and culture mentioned earlier discusses it's how the group. Remember, we talked about the group, the way of life, which talks about their shared practices, their values, and beliefs. And so this focuses really on everyday life events. It's routine interactions, and how also it focuses on the group's way of life. So one of the ways that we might look at this is from a cultural perspective, from our own area, or we could look at it from an educational perspective, or we could also look at this from any of the other social institutions, right? So when we have the basic social institutions, we can look at this in the way of family, the family shared practices, values, and beliefs. We can look at this from a religious standpoint. The culture is the group, the religious group's way of life. It's their shared practices, values, and beliefs. So everything that we are doing, it is the way that we are making sure that everyone follows the rules of the culture. And so our culture includes everything produced by society, including all of our social rules. So, whatever our social rules and norms and values are, is what we as a culture produce, and we insist that members of that culture participate. Now, one thing about the sociological imagination, and C. Wright Mills, who was a pioneer sociologist, basically said that we have an awareness of a relationship between a person's behavior and experience and the wider society and culture that shapes their choices and perceptions. Now, two of his quotes, the first one, neither the life of an individual nor the history of a society can be understood without understanding both. And remember, I just said earlier about how all of this is intertwined and comes together. So we can't separate the life of the individual and the history of society. We cannot separate that. We have to acknowledge that both of these are important and are connected. But the sociological imagination allows us, it enables us to grasp history and biography and the relations between the history and the biography of the two within society. And so here is where Mills says that this is knowing that it's awareness, it's this understanding, this comprehension of the relationship between an individual person's behavior and their experiences and the wider society and culture that shapes the person's choices and perceptions. So what happens is we start to see our own and others' behavior in relation to historical time and place and social structure. And this is what he calls the sociological imagination. Well, we also have social facts. And social facts are ideas or things. And this is basically, we can say laws and morals and values and religious beliefs and customs and fashion and rituals and all of these cultural rules that govern social life. And Durkheim notes these social facts, which include these laws and rules and obligation. And what Durkheim talks about is language is a social fact as well. So currently, we have to look at how social facts also change. And social facts can change via exposure to different social facts. They can change because of new laws, new rules, new values, new customs, new rituals. And so again, how do we look at social facts that and do we look at things differently than our parents did or our grandparents did? And so this is part of the idea of, if we look at what Durkheim is talking about, we talk about religious beliefs. Do we believe exactly the way that our parents believed? Do we follow those same religious constructs? Do we follow the same rituals or we try to find our own ritual and our own moral obligations and our own values and our own perspective of religious belief. So what we're doing is we're shifting our social facts. We're changing our social facts. And one of the ways that I always talk about this is through marriage, is via marriage. Let's look at what marriage was within maybe your grandparents, definitely my parents and my grandparents. And we talked about they get married and they stayed married. And it didn't even matter if they liked each other, they still stayed married. Well, in my generation, we balked some about that. And we decided that, if you weren't involved in a relationship that was equitable, maybe you needed to exit that relationship. So we had really between 1965 onward, we've had some higher levels of divorce. And one of the reasons is because our social facts have shifted. We also have acceptance of same-sex marriage, of gay marriage, marriage equality. So how has this made life different for us as opposed to our families, our parents, our grandparents? We see things differently. We may value things differently. Well, let's look at also examples of social facts. Well, if we're looking at examples of social facts, we have material and non-material. Now, material and non-material, this is very easy to figure out. Non-material goes into the norms, the values, the roles, the systems, language, currency, professional practices. Material is technology, where we live, population distribution. Maybe we also could think about this from a standpoint of material also is what is valued. So it can also be what we value within a culture. So we go back to what Durkheim said about social facts and this whole idea of change, and we determine what is important, because then we are passing this on to people within our peer groups or within our groups of our cultural groups, our peer groups. Now, what is a reification? Well, reification is treating an abstract concept as if it has real material existence. So here's the thing, what is happiness? Happiness is an abstract construct. It's an abstract concept. What is love? Is love marriage? Is love rings? Is love a rose? So what we're doing is we're taking something that is an abstract concept. And what we also are trying to do is tag a material, a piece of material, an article, something I can hold. What can I hold? I can't hold love. That's an abstract concept of love as a feeling. So I have to give a symbol. I have to have a symbol of this abstract construct. And one example that I use, and it really is, especially within the demographic that I normally teach within, from a religious standpoint, we can talk about religion. We can talk about how we view religion. but we have a book often of religious abstract concepts such as values and morals and laws and rituals. And so we have all of this, and we have it in a book. In our book, whatever our book is, whether it is a scriptural text of a Bible, a Torah, a Bhagavad Gita, the Quran, any of these are just teachings and words within a book. We are assigning also the book a idea that it is somehow protected and that it is special because of what it represents. It's not really that the book itself, the physical book itself, is special. It is that the material within the text is special. But this again is kind of what we do with making sure that what we're doing is we are talking about this as it has real material existence. Now, as we look at our moving forward, we are looking at figuration as well. And what is figuration? Figuration is basically saying that what we are doing is that the individual and society are inseparable. The process of analyzing at the same time individuals and the structures in society that shape our behavior, this is figuration. Now, this is really a difficult concept sometimes for people to comprehend, because what it means is this goes back to we cannot study individuals in this vacuum. We have to look at it from the cultural concepts, and we have to look at it from the historical perspective. And so if we are analyzing the behavior of individuals, and what we also have to be doing is we have to look at what are the structures that shape that behavior. So, religion. If we look at religion has a large social context, but religion is an individual ideology and an individual aspect of what is going on. So our religious beliefs, the big church, the institution of religion is one thing. But then what is religion to us individually is something totally different. But you cannot study the individual aspect of religion without studying the larger social context of religion. Now, here's some other things that are always really, as we're talking about figuration. The idea that religion also exists in a larger context. Here are some of the things that we look at. We have state-sanctioned religious holidays. These are recognized religious holidays, and for many people, these are from a majority religious perspective, from a Christianity perspective, and all of the different aspects of what we consider Christianity. we have Good Friday, Easter Sunday, and Christmas. So if Christmas falls on a Tuesday, the banks are closed. We might have shopping closed, the grocery store, but the banks and the government offices are closed, and the schools are closed. So when we're talking about state-sanctioned religious holidays, this is something that we have to look at. On Good Friday, a lot of times, if this is Good Friday, the banks might close half a day. You might have some different things go on. I looked at I remember living in a certain area of the country, and I grew up that if you wanted to eat out on Easter Sunday, there were several places that you could go to eat. In this particular area, on Easter Sunday, no one ate out. So there were no restaurants open. And while it wasn't considered a state-sanctioned religious holiday, the culture of that area indicated that Easter Sunday should be spent at home and not at a restaurant. Trust me, that was very frustrating, as I had never seen that, and I was really not prepared for it. Now, let's also talk about this from a figuration examples from individually celebrated religious holidays. So it's not just that you have religious holidays from a state perspective, but now we also have to look at what are some of the individual religious holidays that we might, within our own individual religious obligations, participate in. So I just use the Catholic Church because I think this is a really interesting concept, that All Hallows Eve, which is also Halloween, and we celebrate that as a Halloween celebration, right? All Saints Day is November 1st. You're expected to attend Mass, and then that's why it's called Hallowmas. And you're celebrating saints, and you're cleaning graves, and you're placing candles and flowers on the graves. And so All Souls Day, though, is a day of prayer, particularly for those who died, who had maybe lesser sins. And in case you didn't know, there are great sins and lesser sins and unforgivable sins and all kinds of interesting things. So what we're doing from this perspective is that we're saying these are individual religious holidays. So again, figuration. How do we separate the larger social concept and context from the individual? We don't. We can't. Because the culture also dictates how we individually celebrate religious holidays. This is, I hope, makes sense to you from the perspective of understanding figuration, understanding the difficulty in separating an individual and a cultural concept, which kind of brings us into the sociological imagination. So the next video you will go to is section 1.2, the history of sociology. So after you leave this one, go to the second video, the history of sociology.